Welcome, everyone, to the 2022 IES Principal Investigators Meeting. I'm Brian Boyd, Director of the Juniper Gardens Children's Project at the University of Kansas and co-chair of this year's annual meeting. I'm sure that many of us were hoping to meet in person this year. Even though we cannot, we believe that this year's virtual program still offers engaging and valuable educational content, learning opportunities, and a different way to network and interact with our colleagues. To kick things off as part of the opening plenary, we will be hearing from 5 inspired speakers who are engaged in educational research and who represent a range of viewpoints and backgrounds. They're going to talk with us about how to center equity and inclusion in your research. We have decided to launch the conference this way to get us all thinking about the next 20 years of IES research and how we can best move forward in our own research and training efforts to meaningfully address issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Immediately following these pre-recorded talks, I'll moderate a live question and answer session with our speakers. Please enter your questions into the Q&A box you hopefully see on your screen, because I'll select from those for our speakers to answer. Again, I welcome you to this year's IESPI meeting. Now, let's hear from our speakers.
Hi there. My name is Chris Gutierrez. I'm a professor in the Graduate School of Education at the University of California, Berkeley. My task today is to contribute to the discussion of how to incorporate issues of equity and inclusion into our research. I do design-based research and employ qualitative approaches to inquiry to study the cultural dimensions of learning. So the goal of my remarks today is to argue that equity cannot be readily achieved in our work unless we design for it, regardless of the methodologies we employ. So let me tell you what I mean by this. Too often, equity gets used as part of the rationale for the work that we want to do, and it remains in its ideal or aspirational form. So what I'd like to talk about today is how to address the kind of more pragmatic side of equity so that it's observable and that it's measurable, and so that it becomes a design principle in our work, so that we're thinking about equity from the moment we are conceptualizing our research to how we're going to design for it, implement it, and then assess it. So equity often drops out somewhere in the research process. And so we want to think about equity and having kind of equity indices and equity-oriented practices as part of the very methods that we're using in our work. So I like to use this metaphor of equity as our miner's canary. And I think that this really helps us understand why privilege equity. I mean, equity has come to mean so many different things. And now sometimes it's not very useful because it does mean everything. But I think the goal of keeping equity at the forefront of our work is that, like the miner's canary, if you know that the function of the miner's canary from mining practices is that the canary would give the first signal of the poisonous gases that could be released in the mine. And so it was a signal to the miners about danger. And I think in the same way, we want to think about equity as one of those measures of the health and vitality, not only of the people in our studies, but in our very research design. So I think that the miner's canary is a really very useful kind of indices that really is an important measure, an ongoing measure in our investigation, right? Whether an investigation is positive or negative, or if there are unintended consequences, particularly for people from what I call non-dominant communities or people from historically marginalized communities. So this calls for a view of equity that is congruent with dynamic notions of culture, high expectations for achievement, rich and rigorous learning practices, and respectful learning that aims for cultural amplification and educational dignity. So what I'd like to talk about today are just briefly the importance of seeking deep understandings of the people and their practices as part of the work that we do. So in my work, in the design-based work, I call it social design-based experiments, but in whatever approach you use, the importance of really trying to seek for complexity and to really deeply understand who the people are and the practices and the ecologies of which they're a part. So just a couple of suggestions that I think orient us to do that kind of work, right? And so part of it is really challenging reductive or static notions of culture. I've written about this, and it's something that we need to think very systematically and thoughtfully about. So one of the things that would help us avoid these static notions of culture is to not equate culture with race and ethnicity. They are not the same thing. Importantly, conflating race and ethnicity with culture often leads to conceptions of cultural learning styles in which there's a one-size-fits-all in a cultural community about learning. So you're attributing a learning style, which doesn't exist, a learning style to people by virtue of their membership in the community, right? So we want to argue for a very different view of learning and suggest that that we want practices that ignore or minimize the significance of variance within cultural communities. So I've come up with this little easy way to think about culture in our work. We call it the 100% Pinata Rule. And that means that we would think about that no culture is shared uniformly, that there's always regularity and variance. And while there may be persistent themes that hold us together and adhere in cultural communities, how we think about cultural practices, their frequency, their value, their implementation is going to vary tremendously from household to household, community to community. So here's where the 100% Pinata Rule comes in. 100% of Mexicans don't hit piñatas 100% of the time, right? And so while the piñata may be a valued cultural practice in some Mexican households, right? Over time, it has come to mean very different things. And in fact, if you live in the Southwest and you have birthday parties, just about everybody uses a piñata. So this is so important to think about to move us away from static notions of culture, right? So that we would never say 100% of Mexicans hit piñatas 100% of the time, nor would we say all African Americans love hip hop, all Asian Americans do well in math, right? Those are the kinds of things and proclamations and generalizations that do not account for the fact that there's always some regularity and variance. In fact, there's more variance within communities than there is across communities. So holding a robust notion of culture is really important in our work. Other things we can think about, again, is seeking complexity in the way we study people, practices, disciplinary learning, right? I take an ecological approach, but there are many approaches that you can take as well. So here are some suggestions that help me and people with whom I work seek complexity, right? To capture the full humanity of people's everyday lives. So I want to think about the resources and constraints of the ecologies that constitute people's lives, right? So there are always affordances and constraints in settings, in households, in institutions, and in ecologies. So I want to make sure that I'm thinking about not just a narrow understanding of what I think I'm seeing, but what are those larger resources available to people, and what are the constraints in that ecology? I also want to move from thinking about just single traits or single strengths of people. But Barbara Rogoff and I have come up with this notion of repertoires of practice, right? And so repertoires of practice refers to heterogeneous toolkits, ways of acting in the world cognitively, linguistically, physically, social, and emotionally, which individuals appropriate throughout their everyday lives as participants in varied communities of practice, even as they navigate the contradictions and tensions, the novel and diversity that come within these kinds of communities. So thinking about people's repertoires that they developed as they move in and across the practices of everyday life, again, is a very useful unit of analysis in our work. That means that we want to move away from studying people in one setting, in one task, and that instead we would really like to look at capturing people's full range of practices understood across at least a couple of activity systems, right? So let me tell you some examples of what I do. I've used this concept of learning as movement as a way to remind us to think about the fact that people move in and across practices of everyday life and something takes hold, something that gets learned. So learning as movement reminds us to pay attention to that movement, right? Pay attention to what gets learned in that movement. And that's how people develop the repertoires of practice that really come to constitute the toolkit that they use in their everyday lives. And this has been a useful metaphor for me to help remind me to attend to just more than one context, one observation of people's practices. So for example, when I worked with high school students from migrant farm worker backgrounds, we would often follow them, not just in the classroom, but we would follow them in their walk from the dorms up into the classrooms, because so many things would happen. They would experience so many things as they would move from the dorms into the classroom, including how to deal with the racial taunts that they'd get in that movement. But it's also important to think about not just following people. I'm very interested in the social organization of learning. So I look at who's there, who's hanging out with whom and in what ways. But it's also really important to pay attention to the tools and how tools move with people across settings. And so we've been able to do some analysis, which again, the point is that it's getting us into richer, fuller, and more complex understandings of people practices. And this was particularly important for me in a study in which I was looking at the new media practices of Latinx families, right? And we ended up focusing on the ingenuity at work in the ways these families thought about and engaged in new media practices. So looking at their movement, there was a lot of sharing of tools. So looking at where they were and looking at who used that tool and where and how was really central to capturing the kind of innovation and ingenuity in our families. So finally, I want to say a little bit about the importance of representing what we learn about people and communities when we're writing up our analyses of what we've learned. So one thing that's been very useful for me and that actually has become commonplace and so it becomes invisible to us in our work is to stop and look at our own work. And I can tell you that the very things that I'm talking about are things that I've done in my own research that I've had to go back and say, oh my goodness, I need to attend to this much more carefully. So it's so important to look at the recurrent social and cultural constructions in our work. What's the analytic frame that I'm using and what's already been assumed in that framework, right? And what's missing, what's taken for granted. So let me give you an example. If I'm interested in studying the work practices of families, what happens if my operating analytical framework is underclass? What's already been taken for granted? What's already assumed? What is it already privileged? And what does it help me not see? So many of us use so many constructs like urban, right? What does urban mean? That marginalized, look, constructs that we become so familiar with, but that have a history and have different meanings and work. And so we want to look at those constructions that we use often unwittingly in our work, to think about how, again, we are representing people, and are we really capturing the nuances and the complexity of people's everyday lives, or the phenomena in which we're interested in. And finally, here's some tips that we have come up with that really help us in our writing to avoid kind of stereotyping people and making proclamations about people in our research, instead of recognizing that we're studying them in a slice of time. So very simply, one way to avoid making overly general statements about people is to speak in the past tense in our work. Using the present tense makes our observation a state of being. Chris is, right? Chris is doing this, as opposed to Chris did, right? And so the past tense really aligns with our analysis that at this particular time, this is what we saw. So something as simple as avoiding the past, speaking in the past tense, is an important strategy. Another way to avoid overgeneralizing is, as I've mentioned earlier, is that we want to, that we should be very careful about basing our conclusions on single observations, right? That's the beauty of longitudinal work. That's the beauty of what we call multi-sided ethnographies, or multi-sided sensibilities, is that we are looking at people across time and space to make statements about what we see. And then finally, to examine aspects of participants' community and how these aspects cluster. And so we want to treat, when we're looking at our analysis, treat these aspects as a constellation of factors rather than singling out just one. For example, if I want to look at the relationship between culture and patriarchy, I might also want to look at, the history of colonialism, that I might also want to look at the political economies in that setting, that I would look at schooling availability. There'd be a number of things in that constellation that would help me from just making more simple kinds of conclusions about people and their communities. So all this is to say is that good research involves attending to equity, but also part of that is capturing that complexity. And what I've tried to argue with you today is it involves some intentionality. That's why I say equity needs to be a design principle, not just an aspiration in our work. We have to articulate commitments about the kind of views that we hold and that we hope to accomplish in our work, that we want to understand people's learning and or phenomena across settings, employing robust notions of culture and using tools of representation that capture the richness, the nuances, the complexity, and the humanity of the people with whom we partner in our work. So if you have any questions, you can find me on Twitter at Chrisco, and please email me any questions. I would love to continue this conversation with you. Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Adrienne Meschina, a professor in human ecology at UC Davis. And I just wanted to start today by thanking the organizers Brian Boyd and Dory LaForette, as well as Liz Albro and Joan McLaughlin, and everyone at IES for including me here today. This has been a really fun challenge to put together this talk. So today I have one big picture recommendation, as well as one more concrete recommendation for you to consider. So I was driving to campus recently, and the radio had a program about this being the 30th anniversary of the LA riots. I was actually in high school at the time in Long Beach, California, a city that was only about 18 miles from the flashpoint of the riots, and two recollections came back to me. First, this was a completely different era. It was before social media and ubiquitous news, so we actually still went to school the next day. And second, I remember that although my school was among the most racially and ethnically diverse in the state at the time, there wasn't any racial or ethnic conflict on campus. And this isn't to say that there were never any problems or that the school did things perfectly, but it was just reassuring that what was happening in the region did not spill over into the school. So why was this? I think in retrospect, it was because the school had capitalized on its diversity and always provided opportunities for students from different backgrounds to interact. Most of us didn't have the means to travel extensively, but the school held these international fairs in which school clubs raised money through selling cultural food items. And in this way, we not only got to dispel any preconceived notions we may have had, but we also got to learn new ways of being and thinking, in this case, approaches to food. So in my world, I went on to be a researcher who studies diversity. Another alumnus of the high school appears to have drawn from the cultural food exchange experiences that we all had. A few years later, I found myself fittingly for this presentation at Horace Mann Junior High. It was just a block from where the LA riots had started. I was doing data collection as an undergrad research assistant. And when I got there, I remember noticing how nice the lawns looked. And in Southern California, that's a sign of a good neighborhood. I realized that I hadn't even known the preconceived notions I had of the context until I was actually there. So when presented with a question for this morning about how to better incorporate equity and inclusion in our work, I kept coming back to this same theme, how useful it can be to put yourself in the direct interactions with people and contexts different from those with which you're familiar. The easiest is through travel. And if you want to cite this as justification for traveling for your research, that's great. But travel is where you have many opportunities to interact with others who are different from you. And I think there's also something to be said for personally experiencing contexts in which maybe you're not able to get others to understand what you're trying to say, or you realize you're completely illiterate in the local language, or maybe you look around and you see that no one looks like you, or maybe that everyone looks like you. And of course, some of us have already had these experiences, but it really gives us a different perspective on equity and inclusion. Of course, recent conditions have made unfettered travel more difficult, but lucky for us, we've all just experienced something like unanticipated travel, and that's been through moving our lives online. Before the pandemic, you may have imagined what it was like to learn or interact or teach solely online. But now, a few years out, we likely have a much different perspective on online learning. So, for example, in my case, in my research on peer relationships and racial and ethnic diversity, it really highlighted how much peer interactions decrease online overall. But in particular, it's those cross-ethnic peer interactions that become more infrequent, and how we could more intentionally facilitate not only social interactions, but in particular, these cross-group interactions for remote learners. I'm sure on reflection, you can think of your own examples of how these experiences brought on new ways of thinking about your own work. Now, I know I also promised one concrete recommendation as well. And so there's this group of students who actually grow up consistently navigating multiple groups and interacting with people who are different from them. And this really affords them some unique perspectives about inclusion. It's a rapidly growing population, over 15% of the youth population. And yet we often reclassify or entirely exclude them in our research. So any guesses about who this might be? That group is multiracial, multi-ethnic youth. So my concrete recommendation is to make sure that as researchers, we consider how to be more inclusive of their unique experiences in educational research. They reflect a demographic that we can no longer afford to ignore. And I'm very happy to chat more about that later in the Q&A. So in the spirit of my theme of experiencing diversity to promote greater equity and inclusion, I really encourage you to take the time during this PI meeting to talk to someone whose research is seemingly different from your own. The good news is that we all have the same overall goals to improve the lives and educational experiences of through research and practice and policy. And so if we use that as our jumping off point and commonality, I think we can have some really interesting discussions over the next few days, and hopefully as a result, integrate greater equity and inclusion back into our own work. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Dr. Jamie Pearson, and I'm an assistant professor of special education at North Carolina State University. I'm going to share today about the FACES program, a family-centered approach towards addressing disparities among Black autistic youth and their families. So first, I'd like to highlight a few disparities in diagnoses, service access, and service utilization. Autism surveillance suggests that there's a similar prevalence of autism across racial and ethnic backgrounds. You've likely seen the most recent report from the CDC, which indicates that the prevalence has now increased to 1 in 44 students, 1 in 44 children at ages 4 and 8. And so this prevalence is fairly consistent across racial and ethnic backgrounds. But one thing we know, given recent research findings from some of my work and other researchers like David Mandel and Jones et al., there's similar prevalence, yet despite the similar prevalence, there are disparities in service access that persist, particularly for Black autistic youth and their families. For example, Black children with autism often have delayed diagnoses, delayed access to services, and then challenges and barriers that they face with regard to service utilization. In some cases, we see that these issues, like these challenges and barriers, are a result of diagnostic disparities that often reflect provider bias. So we see some of these systemic challenges that really influence the rates at which Black autistic youth are diagnosed, and some of the barriers that they face with regard to getting service access. So in my work, I developed the FACES intervention, which stands for Fostering Advocacy, Communication, Empowerment, and Support. And this is a parent training intervention that's designed to really help Black parents in particular be able to build their sense of empowerment, to then be better situated to address disparities that their children face. And so we work in this intervention to help families think about how they can build their autism knowledge, again, how they can strengthen empowerment, their communication and partnership with schools, with related service providers, with healthcare providers, and then also their use of evidence-based strategies. So how can they better support their children with regard to socialization, communication, and managing behavior? One of the really interesting sort of preliminary findings we saw in the FACES program during the pilot study was that families really built a strong sense of community. And so Black families in particular often have felt left out of other support groups, for example, sometimes haven't felt the sense of inclusion in other programming and supports. And so in FACES, we've seen this really exciting finding that families have been able to build this community and that they've been able to organically support each other, both during the intervention and post-intervention. So how can you think about incorporating equity and inclusion in your own work? One of the ways to do this is to start by really engaging in researcher reflexivity or cultural responsivity. So for me, like this is how I begin all of my work with regard to my research and also my teaching. So start by identifying your own values, beliefs, and biases. And sometimes it might be tricky, it might feel difficult or sticky to kind of sit with that, but I think that's a really critical first step. Then you want to reflect on how your identity impacts your research. I identify as a Black woman. And so I have to think about what does my identity and the intersections of my identity, how do those impact the work that I do and the populations with whom I work. And then also with regard to this reflexivity, you want to engage in practices that limit your researcher bias. So really be transparent about who you are and maybe that you are working with this population for the first time, or that you want to learn more about what their experiences are and how those experiences might play a role in the work that you're doing. A second strategy with regard to incorporating equity and inclusion is working with working to build stakeholder partnerships. And so in this community engaged work that I do, it's really critical to build really strong stakeholder partnerships at the outset, right? So before I begin in this work, really thinking about how do I engage in reciprocal partnerships that address community needs. So what are the community needs and how can I help support those, right? But also thinking about how do we engage communities who are interested in this work, but who could also potentially benefit from programming like FACES or from parent advocacy interventions or family-based interventions. And then finally, it's really critical to think about engaging stakeholders at each phase of the process. So in this work, we're thinking about Black autistic youth. We're thinking about Black autistic or Black families largely, and really thinking about how we define family. So thinking of that broadly is really important because sometimes we see that it is sort of the traditional nuclear family, but oftentimes we have more extended family members who are supporting autistic youth. And so it's really critical that we engage a variety of stakeholders who can help us think about this work, who can provide feedback, who can help us vet it, and make sure that we're engaging in strategies and implementation that's not only addressing the needs of families, but particularly contributing to strong outcomes for Black autistic youth. So finally, what's one final sort of first step towards incorporating equity and inclusion in your work? I would say to start by centering the voices and lived experiences of historically marginalized communities. So even if your work isn't specifically about Black autistic youth, for example, thinking about those participants in your studies, in the work that you're conducting, who can benefit, right? Who can benefit most? Who do you need to reach to really make sure you're understanding the cultural nuances of their experiences? Making sure you're highlighting voices that often go unheard is a really important first step in thinking about how to be more inclusive and more equitable in our research. Thank you so much for your time. You can contact me here at jmpierso@ncsu.edu at North Carolina State University. Thank you so much.
I'm Chin Reyes, Assistant Professor at the Yale Child Study Center. I'm here today to share my reflections over the years as a first-generation immigrant and research scientist. One of the most famous lines in Star Wars, being a fan of the saga, is Obi-Wan Kenobi reminding Luke Skywalker that many of the truths we cling to depend greatly on our point of view. Researchers wear a lens that is shaped by their education and experiences. I invite you all as colleagues and experts to share in this community of knowledge, to reflect together, to act collectively and drive equity-oriented practices in our research. We may not have all the answers, but we can all challenge each other to get there. For context, only 8% of the world's children live in high-income countries, what we call the minority world. 95% of what we know about how humans think and learn is based on data from the minority world. Of these, 68% are from the United States. In other words, 95% of what we know is based on 8% of the world's population. These populations are described as weird, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Weird populations primarily are the basis for generalizations we make about human nature. The goal of education is to ensure that students become productive citizens. Education sciences should recognize that there are many paths toward this goal. Equity is an action word. It's not an afterthought, nor is it a concept that we tailor conveniently to our self-interests. It is something we do intentionally and deliberately, and not a piecemeal approach. Equity should pervade every facet of the research process, from conceptualization to dissemination. Beginning with conceptualization, beyond the question, who are the participants, we should ask ourselves, how did we choose our participants? Who are we including, excluding? Who would benefit the most, the least? How do we honor diversity within groups? For instance, in the case of dual language learners, how do we consider linguistic diversity, Spanish, Mandarin, Urdu, Portuguese, within this population? Another charge is to place equity at the forefront of our work and not just pay lip service by articulating explicitly what aspect of inequity we're addressing and why our research is well positioned to answer these questions. For example, What specific components of our DLL science intervention makes it particularly beneficial for DLLs and not just students in general? Research should be about meeting educators where they are. Our study should have a direct application to a pressing need educators are facing. For example, we ask, what is the best way to address challenging behaviors in these schools with these particular students, recognizing that administrators and teachers have competing sets of priorities and instructional goals? Building equity in research begins with ensuring that our study team represents the breadth and depth of skills, expertise, and experiences. How do we ensure that multiple perspectives are represented? And how do we recognize differences in power and stature and ensure that all voices are heeded and that we are addressing local priorities and perspectives? How do we involve stakeholders at the systems, service, and beneficiary levels as thought partners to ensure an equitable process across all phases of the investigation, including the choice of measurement tools? How do we keep ourselves accountable, perhaps by appointing a study advisory board committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion? When recruiting trainees, how do we improve current recruitment practices to motivate applicants from underrepresented groups who may not have similar experiences to apply? And once hired, how do we ensure their growth and success? Methodology. Often the tools we select are based on the white, weird lens, which leads to a deficit orientation if we do not meet the standard. What is measured is treasured. What is not measured is neglected and undervalued. How do we ensure that the assessment tools we use honor and celebrate the strengths and cultures of the communities we're studying? What are we not measuring? And reliance on quantitative measures leaves little room for understanding the richness of the phenomena we're investigating. Some ways we can diversify data collection methods include applying mixed methods designs, and when appropriate, implementing indigenous methods, employing data collectors or observers who understand the nuances of the context under investigation. Analyses. We operationalize people numerically, but numbers cannot tell the full story if we forget that numbers represent people. Our analytic choices have implications on how we interpret the data. For example, when we control for sociodemographic factors when estimating the impact of our intervention on student performance, we are essentially making sociodemographic variables, quote unquote, invisible. Think about the implications of the intervention's effects on the outcome variable. For whom does the intervention really work? Another challenge to equity is not having enough power to analyze the data. We also tend to merge certain groups when in reality, doing so doesn't make sense. For instance, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are often grouped together as if they were a monolithic entity, knowing that there is so much diversity within this category. Equity in research entails that we magnify the visibility of children who are otherwise deemed as statistically insignificant. Discussion. Share your results with partners and key stakeholders. They can provide us with feedback and help us ensure a strengths-based approach when reporting results. We also contextualize our study's findings within the specific parameters of our study with the utmost humility and state what potential sources of inequities we fail to address and how researchers could address these knowledge gaps in future studies. Dissemination. Academics are under a lot of pressure to publish, sometimes at the expense of choosing publications over the public. How much of our work actually gets communicated outside of journal articles that mostly only researchers read? We need to emphasize the utility of science for the public good by employing thoughtful strategies for dissemination. But why care about equity in the first place? Equity is not just a moral imperative, it's an economic imperative. The Heckman curve demonstrates that investing in high-quality education early education leads to societal savings in reduced costs in remedial education, in reduced health and criminal justice system expenditures, and increased work productivity. These data were derived from longitudinal studies. of predominantly African American children. The Chicago Child Parent Center's Abecedarian Project Perry Preschool, between 92% to 100% of those were African American children. In other words, our Black children give us the greatest return of investment, yet they are the ones who are disproportionately kicked out of the very institution that justifies its existence. Moreover, America is undergoing demographic changes. An estimated 4.6 million students in the US are English language learners. By 2060, it's projected that nearly 1 in 5 of the US population will be foreign born. This makes it critical to address the rise in non-English language speaking children who will comprise the future workforce of this country. I'd like to end the presentation with the following images. 2 children, one taller, one shorter, reaching out for the books and toys on the shelf. They represent diversity of learners. Now imagine that the books and toys represent knowledge or success. How do we achieve equity? We achieve equity if we commit to systemic change. Social justice is about getting to the root of the problem to create a lasting impact. When we commit to equity work, as our new business as usual in research, every child gets a fair start at achieving their goals, and we maximize their potential to grow and thrive. Working towards equity requires everyone's work, and everyone benefits.
Hi, I'm LaShawn Richburg-Hayes, Vice President of Education from Insight Policy Research, and I'm here to talk to you about how I learned about culturally responsive and equitable evaluation while trying to solve another problem. Data are not objective. As a trained economist, I would have taken umbrage with this statement just 4 years ago. I imagine that I would have countered that data can be misrepresented and that research can be flawed, but that good research can be objective, and randomized controlled trials is one methodology to help. I concede that this is naive. A series of events actually changed my perspective, but I'll share one with you. I had to attend a principal investigators conference, much like this one. And during that conference, I had to share a problem that my project was experiencing. This was pre-pandemic. I shared a problem about the management structure associated with the institution where I was studying, doing a program evaluation. And I was seeking some input as to how I could overcome this problem. One of my fellow researchers commented that what I had was institutional racism, for which I was floored. But later during this conference, I attended a session that was led by David Kirkland, a professor from NYU. And David led a deep game, a simulated game to help uncover some aspects of inequality in programming. So I, along with 40 other researchers, engaged in this game that had 5 simple rules. 1, we were all allocated 3 pieces of Starburst. 2, colors had different values. So for example, the pink would be worth 10 points. 3, we all had to engage in trading without talking. 4, the Starburst had to be hidden if we were not trading. And 5, if we violated any of the 4 rules above, we would be arrested. I was fortunately endowed in the well-endowed group. So I was able to be in the group that had the highest value Starburst. At the end of the first round of play, I had not traded. There was no benefit for me trading. I had the highest value, and I noticed that only the people with lower value Starburst were willing to show what they had in trade. So at the end of the first round, I ended up in a small group with similar high endowments. There was a median-sized group with average endowments and a very large group of people who had small endowments. For my efforts in gaining admission to the high endowment group, our group was able to change one rule for the game, and we changed the rule that required everyone to trade at least once. In the second round of the game, Again, there was no incentive for me to trade. I circled the room. I engaged in trading activity like, but I didn't trade. I again ended up in the small group with high endowments. This time the medium-sized group was slightly larger, and the low endowment group was a bit smaller. The facilitator lauded my group's prowess and creativity in maintaining our high endowments and trading to get there, and provided encouragement and prep to the low endowment group to follow our actions. Again, my group was awarded by changing another rule, and we changed the rule to increase the value of a Starburst, not the highest value Starburst, but the second highest value. The third round proceeded with the same pattern, and I ended up where I started, again in the high endowment group. So here's what I realized. There is a system that governs outcomes. I had no incentive to trade, and despite being altruistic, I had no incentive to do that as well. The system that was set up such that the balance of power and wealth endowments were tightly aligned. While this is obvious, the positionality of power and wealth, this for me was a quite jarring juxtaposition, because it's very different from my upbringing and very different from my social identity. Yet I behaved in ways within the system that was in alignment with the reduction of power and the lifting of privilege. And this reminded me a lot of systems of racism and poverty. On the basis of this experience, this led me to a lot of self-reflection, but also to learn a lot more about culturally responsive and equitable evaluation practices. An evaluation is culturally responsive if it considers the behaviors and the context of participants in the program being evaluated. It's equitable if it considers the structural factors and other items that perpetuate inequity in America. I think every researcher can do more to incorporate diversity, equity, and inclusion in our work. I think that begins with familiarizing yourself with the history and the context of the program that you're studying, to mitigate implicit blame of the victim when context and structure and the system really matters. Broaden your perspective through personal reflection. Understand your positionality and how that affects your perspectives and how you go about your research, who you involve, and how you involve them. The third point I think every researcher can do is change an aspect or aspects of your research approach. This may be thinking about the power distribution according to funding, step 1 in We All Counts data equity framework, or including multiple perspectives in the development of your research question, which is step 3 in this framework. Wherever you are in your research approach, there are steps and components that can improve a CRE approach. And finally, 4, take personal and professional responsibility for change. While concepts of positionality and perspectives were not part of my graduate training, and it may be part of many graduate studies today, as researchers, we're responsible for educating ourselves continually. And this is another area for which we can improve. Thank you, and I look forward to the Q&A.
I think all of you can likely see why we asked these 5 panelists to speak today and to kick us off around this important conversation related to diversity, equity, inclusion. I couldn't think of 5 better speakers to help us launch this conference. So thank you all for doing so. So we do have some questions and we don't have a lot of time, but I want to get some in. I'm actually going to take a little prerogative as the moderator and sort of ask the first question that I had. All of the talks were equally brilliant, but I was really struck by something, Chen, that you said, and that is what is measured is treasured. And so I guess for Chen and the other panelists, whoever else wants to sort of chime in, can you talk to us maybe about what else should we be measuring? What are we forgetting to measure that will help us better center equity and inclusion in our research? So maybe Chen, if you want to start off, and then we can open it up to others.
All right. Well, thank you for noting that. So maybe just a general example. Coming from someone who's, from a different culture, like when you first come into this country, there's a lot of emphasis, on Western notions of what intelligence is and what, appropriate ways of measuring, academic success is. And we know very little of what values different families may have. I was just thinking about a colleague of mine, and growing up, she's now a PhD, and growing up, she grew up in a single mother household, Latino. And she just remembered, and she was just reflecting on, what she's been studying in grad school. And when you think about measuring, for instance, the quality of the home environment, the intellect, how do parents stimulate thinking? And she just remembers growing up in a household where her mother struggled and, didn't really read books to her, but she was able to overcome all those things because the mother was also engaging her in a lot of day-to-day conversations that, if you were to use, let's say, the home scale, may not pick up on, the kinds of conversations that some families may have. And so we're not thinking about other ways of how children learn. So, that's just one example. I'm sure my colleagues will have like a lot more.
Does anyone else want to add to that?
Jump in. I think it's also critical to think about how we define and for whom we define social validity. So particularly when we're thinking about supporting children with disabilities and their families, I think highlighting the voices of students with disabilities when we're measuring social validity, and really working to engage them in ways that highlights their voices and in ways that we're able to then implement their perspectives on, particularly with intervention research, right? In what ways is this helpful? Is it beneficial? What changes can we make in iterative research? And so I think including the voices of our populations with whom we work in measures of social validity is really critical.
Thank you, Jamie. So another sort of almost hot topic question, I would say, came in that I would love for the panelists to respond to. And it was, within states that are implementing laws to impede equity and inclusion, are there any recommendations for how we navigate this? Chris, do you have any thoughts? Or I'm happy to call on people.
Well, one of the things I tried to do was to take these issues of equity and make them just part and parcel of the kinds of designs and methodological approaches that we use. And so I think as researchers, we can do a whole lot and never have to label it with any of the buzzwords that are freaking out people in particular states. Part of it is just doing good science, right? Really when I'm talking about trying to account for people's fuller repertoires and robust cultural learning and cultural practices, those are things that we can actually attend to very thoughtfully and carefully in our work to ensure that we as researchers are not becoming complicit, right, to some of those narratives that are not grounded in science, right? Our work is grounded in science. And so I think we have a wonderful opportunity to do good work that will at the same time really push back on those narratives that come out of folk knowledge in a lot of other places, right? So I really think, and as a methodologist, that that's really important to me, that the way I think about my work from the very beginning to the way I write it, really important step in pushing back on and building up, I think, equitable practices.
I would like to add to that. So I completely agree with Chris. And I think one of the things I mentioned in my talk, as being a methodologist and being an economist in particular, and thinking about things in a very structured way, can actually lead you to reinforce the very things that you are working against by being silent. And so while the methodology that we use to be considered rigorous may not touch on these topics, in the gaze of conducting very good research, I think touches on many of the things that Chris outlined in her talk. And that means expanding your toolkit of your methodology such that you can address the variance and the complexity, and you can talk about it without ignoring it, which can then fuel into those very voices that are not based on science.
I had another kind of related thought, and that came up, has sort of been a theme throughout the day so far, is really just thinking about also, some schools and some districts are more apt to and open to participating in research and research studies, and thinking about the degree to which that also provides researchers and science with a biased view of what is going on. So thinking about how we might build better connections to schools who and districts who would typically decline to be part of research, I think will be a really important thing for us to think about moving forward.
And I think it means us also thinking about better ways of explaining what we mean. I'm thinking of my work with policymakers on the Hill. How do you talk about complexity and variance and regularity without having their eyes glaze over, right? And so, just simple metaphors. I talked with them about having a binocular vision, that with one lens, you have to talk about a category, right? Like, I don't use English language learners. Let's just say English language learners. So you have to have a category to make policy on. But if you don't use that other lens that looks at the variability within that category, then you're not going to make very good policy or practice. And so part of the work is, how do we take the kind of complex work we do and make it accessible to people who are really making the decisions? And I think that's really important.
Well, I know we probably need a lot more time to talk about these complex issues, but to some degree, Chris, what you just brought up is a good, I think, place for the last question that we'll have time for today, which is, how do we, and anyone can take this, how do we sort of discuss some of the complexity around these issues to practitioners and policymakers? What are good strategies for talking about the complexity around issues of center of equity and inclusion? How do we convey that to these audiences, to these different audiences of practitioners and policymakers? Do people have thoughts about that?
I think, it is acknowledging that the issue is very complex, and the issue of equity, for some people, why the focus on this and not that? It always comes up, it depends on which perspective you're coming from. And I think the fact that we acknowledge that it is complex, and kind of how I started my talk, is really for us together as scientists, as researchers, to have this as an ongoing conversation, because there is no one answer, and it really requires changes, not just from the researchers, but also at the systems level. If we don't make those changes, if we don't value equity enough to score it, for instance, in an IAS grant review, I don't think we're going to get there as fast as we need to.
I think it's also important to help
Anyone
practitioners.
else?
Sorry. I think it's also important to help practitioners understand, really understand equity in their own settings, right? And have tangible examples of what inequities look like in those spaces. And I think when people are better able to understand that and see how inequities impact communities in their schools or in their spaces, things will start to click a bit. And I think that's a starting point, right? When we think about cultural reciprocity and when we think about engaging in sort of our own reflection, part of that begins with understanding what are the equities and inequities that we're facing in these spaces.
So I really like developing a set of equity indices, right, as part of the way I'm conceptualizing the study. Because if I'm looking at emergent bilinguals, for example, in schools, I might want to look at the degree of segregation in their schools, their access to high status courses, et cetera, et cetera. So there are indices that I think will help monitor, right, will help me attend to and measure the kinds of whether equity is persistent, what equity looks like in that setting. So I think it's really useful to have a set of indices that we articulate in our work.
Thank you. So I know, unfortunately, we have a short time for discussion today, but we have this platform. I encourage all of the attendees to use the virtual platform to continue to engage in these important conversations throughout the remainder of this meeting. So thank you for joining us today, and I hope you have a wonderful IAS conference.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks to Brian for organizing.